This is Shalom World Podcast.
Welcome to Voyage. This is a podcast where we take you to the world of the Apocalypse of John. This is the book of Revelation. I am your host, Frances Hogan. We're in chapter 12, and I want to go on to the second sign. John said, "Then a second sign appeared in the sky, a huge red dragon, which had 7 heads and 10 horns, and each of the 7 heads crowned with a coronet." So now we meet the enemy of the woman. Why does John use the expression a dragon? If you go into the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 21, the dragon is the great sea monster. Now, a great sea monster means a very large fish. So are we talking about whales, or are we talking about sharks, or what are we talking about? Okay. Psalm 74 verses 13 to 15 speaks about the sea serpent and uses the term Leviathan. So at long last we have a name. Okay. And this Leviathan represented for them the monster of chaos. That's very interesting, and it tells you why they begin to identify the term dragon with Satan, okay, the monster of chaos. And it's also considered the monster of untamed human nature, which is chaos as well, of course. In Deuteronomy 32, verse 33, it's the serpent and the cobra. Now, the cobra is very, very interesting because the cobra was actually in the crown of the Pharaoh. He was a talking serpent. Now, do you get me? Or he was a Satan. A Satan is an enemy, okay? So we're told in Isaiah 27:1 that God overcomes the dragon. We're told in Daniel 7:7 that the dragon has 7 heads and 10 horns. That's our introduction to chapter 13. And it's interesting that in the Roman army, some of the legions actually took either the dragon or the snake as their symbol, which is very, very interesting. So you will understand, therefore, that the dragon represents all that is evil and all that opposes the people of God. Now, for the people of Israel, the snake and the dragon represent Satan himself. Now, John says that the dragon was red or scarlet in colour. And this is a very interesting detail. You don't omit any of the details that he actually gives. So the colour red in the Bible can represent royalty, the royal robes. But in the Apocalypse, you'll find that the red garment represents sin and immorality, because you're going to find the great harlot in chapter 17 dressed in this scarlet robe as well. And the scarlet robe represents blood, because Satan always demands human sacrifice, whether that is in abortion at one end, euthanasia at the other, or war and destruction, or martyrdom in terms of killing the saints. And so we will be told in chapter 17, verses 3 to 4, that the red dragon is gorged with the blood of the martyrs and iniquity. Okay. But it's not that simple. And that's why when you have an image like this, you have to really look into what John is actually saying, because the human beings who were the heads of the empires that are the beasts of the Old Testament are also called dragons or beasts or monsters. For example, Jeremiah 51:34 refers to Nebuchadnezzar, the head of the king of Babylon, as a dragon or a monster. He was a monster in every sense of the word. Ezekiel 29:33 refers to Pharaoh as a dragon or a monster, and the Pharaoh in the Exodus was a monster. Daniel 7 verses 1 to 7 calls the Greek empire of Antiochus IV Epiphanes as a beast or a monster, and he was. And he persecuted the people of God in a dreadful way. So John tells us here, as an introduction to chapter 13, that the dragon has 7 heads and 10 horns. In other words, he works very well in political systems, and he works very well through empires. In other words, Satan is into power. And if human beings really want power and lust for power, unfortunately, they'll meet the beast. You can refer to Satan as a 7-headed monster, or the empires that he runs. Okay, and we'll deal with the empires when we get to chapter 13. Now, he has got 10 horns. Now, a horn is a symbol of strength, and therefore it's a symbol of mighty power. And 10 is the fullness. So 10 horns means a superpower. So in the end times, for example, if the horn is a symbol of communication, as the shofar, the ram's horn, was a symbol of communication to God's people, it means that the world powers will use the media to dominate the world, which they're doing at the moment. You can get a person from the World Health Organization telling you exactly what to do in any country you live in. That's the powers that be using the horn as a means of communication. But what John wants you to hear is that evil on the earth is made in the image of Satan. You need to know that. And the woman, the glorious woman, is made in the image of God. So the two of them are absolute enemies. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed, and so on. Genesis 3:15. So the story of the woman and the dragon goes right back to the very beginning. The very beginning, of course, means the beginning of the human race. And then the beginning of Israel, then the beginning of the church. But Jesus said in chapter 1 of Revelation, I am the Alpha, the beginning, and I am the Omega, the end. And that's exactly what we're dealing with here in Revelation, beginnings and endings. I'll give you more on that. In chapter 13 and 17, we're told that the beast has 7 heads and 10 horns and is also scarlet in colour. So the empires that oppose the people of God are in the image of Satan as well. And Satan, of course, is always contending for world domination because he wants the world to worship him and not Christ. So you've got this great battle going on all the time. It started in the heavens, and we're going to see that in a minute, and it ends up on the earth. So we're told that the 7 heads are crowned. That is Satan laying claim to Christ's right to rule the earth, because twice in Revelation we're going to hear that Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Therefore, he alone is the emperor of the earth. He alone has the right to rule the earth. But Satan claims that. And Satan has his second coming before Jesus has his second coming. It's very interesting. He keeps on imitating him in a perverse way. Now, in verse 4, John tells us that the dragon pulls 1/3 of the stars from the sky. Now, if you're thinking of the constellations in the heavens, forget about it. We were told in chapter 1, verse 20, chapter 2, verse 1, chapter 3, verse 1, that the stars mean the church, the people of God. And we're told here in Revelation 12:1 that the 12 stars in the crown of the woman are the 12 apostles when you're talking about the church, and the 12 patriarchs when you're talking about Israel. So Matthew 13, verse 43 says that the virtuous will shine like stars in the kingdom of heaven. Genesis 22:17, Abraham is told your seed will be like the stars. Talking the stars there in terms of number. So what is John saying here in chapter 12? Because this is our introduction to all the drama that's coming. He's going to tell us, don't forget that in the original rebellion against God, Lucifer pulled 1/3 of the angels away from God. They are now the demonic powers that oppose us. And now he succeeds in pulling 1/3 of the people of God away from the Lord. That is the great apostasy. We can't have the antichrist in chapter 13 unless the great apostasy comes first. And that is the great apostasy, 1/3 of the stars of the heavens. Now, it doesn't mean 1/3 of the 12 around the crown. It doesn't mean that. It means 1/3 of the people of God. Okay, so it's a great apostasy, and it will appear as if Satan is winning. And the Lord stands back and lets Satan pull as many stops as he can, and then he just comes and overcomes him just by the breath of his mouth. So let's look at what is being said here. We're told that verse 4, the tail of the dragon dragged 1/3 of the stars from the sky and dropped them to the earth. Now, from the sky is from the church. We're talking about Jesus' heaven. We're talking the heavens are the church, the earth is the unbelieving world. Drop them to the earth means that they lose all faith. Remember, Jesus said, when I return, will there be any faith on the earth? Satan will have done a tremendous work before Jesus comes. So they're dropped to the earth, so they become materialistic, they become worldly, they become this world-centered, and they lose their vision of heaven, they lose their vision of their vocation, they lose their vision of their destiny, and Satan keeps them downward, and he increases materialism, and he increases pleasure, and he increases everything that keeps us completely looking in the wrong direction, looking downward instead of looking upward. So the chastisement of the Lord will get people again looking upward so that they can find their destiny again. God doesn't like causing us pain, but he sometimes has to cause pain to get us to look in the right direction so that we begin to magnify the Lord instead of magnifying the beast, for example. We'll see that in chapter 13. So then, having pulled the stars from the sky and dropped them to the earth, the dragon stopped in front of the woman. Now, this is the woman Israel at the time of Christ's birth, and it's the woman church at the time of the birth of the church. It's both, because John is speaking about both. So the dragon stopped in front of the woman as she was having the child, so that he could eat it as soon as the child is born from the mother. As you know, if you have looked at programs of the wild, that animals who prey on other animals will always go for the newborns and for the delicate ones and the ones who cannot run as fast as the rest of the flock and so on. So they'll always go for the delicate ones. So an infant is the most delicate of all that you can get. So we saw already that as soon as Christ was born, Herod tried to kill him and he had to escape out into the desert of Egypt, okay, for 3 years. I think that's interesting because you're going to find that woman church has to go out into the desert for 3 years as well because he's trying to kill her at the very beginning of her life as well. And so you find that as soon as the church was born, persecution started. It started in Israel first, and then the Roman Empire tried to absolutely swallow the church up, okay? So the child who is attacked, first of all, it's the Christ, that's the head. And secondly, it's the church, that's the members, okay? Destined to rule the world, okay? And this is very important because it's proclaimed very clearly in Psalm 2 and Psalm 110. Both Psalms acknowledged by both Israel and the church as being specifically about Messiah. Okay, so what does Psalm 2 say? I just want to give you this one and then you can look up Psalm 110 yourselves. Why is this uproar among the nations? Why is this impotent muttering of pagans? Kings of the earth rising in revolt and princes plotting against the Lord and against his anointed. Now let us break their fetters. Let us throw off their yoke. The one who sits, whose throne is in heaven, sits laughing. The Lord derides them. That means that the Lord is omnipotent, that he doesn't even have to say a word in order to overcome them. We're going to see this in chapter 19. Jesus doesn't have to actually say anything. Then angrily he addresses them, and in a rage he strikes them with panic. This is my king installed by me on Zion, my holy mountain. In other words, the eternal decree is that Jesus of Nazareth is not only the King of the Jews, but he's the King of kings and the Lord of lords. And then the Messiah says, let me proclaim the Lord's decree, for he has said to me, you are my son, today I have become your father. And I will give you the nations for your heritage. I will give you the ends of the earth for your domain. With an iron scepter you will break them and shatter them with potter's ware. Very clearly stated. No ambiguity. So when the Messiah was born, he was the child destined to rule the earth. Now, what is the iron rod? In the first century, John uses the iron rod because you can't bend it with your hands. You need to heat it to a very high degree to get the iron to actually bend. And so the iron rod represents God's eternal, absolute, divine will. It's unchanging. He declared it ab aeterno, And it doesn't matter whether you belong to the Israel at the time of Moses or the church now or any time. It actually doesn't matter. God's eternal will is eternal. And people nowadays think that because they want to go a different path, that God should change his mind about his eternal will. That's not going to happen. When we come to chapters 21 and 22, we're going to see that the people living in the New Jerusalem, in the new heavens, are actually living God's will. Thy will be done on earth. That's in the New Jerusalem, the new heavens. As it is done in heaven, it'll be done divinely. So it'll be the highest point that the human race will ever reach. Okay. And then John says that the child was snatched up to heaven. Okay. That's his victory over Satan, and he's taken up into glory in his resurrection and ascension. And the thing is, Jesus is the only person who ever walked this earth who left a mystical body behind him. Nobody else ever made such a claim. And so when Jesus himself is snatched up into glory, then the demonic forces go after the rest of the body of Christ. And that's what the rest of the chapter 12 is actually talking about. Okay. And we're told in verse 6 that the woman escaped into the desert where God had a place of safety made for her for 3.5 years. Okay. There is an Exodus theme here, because when God snatched his people out of Egypt and he brought them to a wilderness where they would be safe, where they could become a people of God, where they could become a line of kings and priests to serve our God, and they were meant to rule the world. Okay. But Egypt had tried to absolutely destroy them initially. Okay. But she was safe in the wilderness, as Jeremiah tells us in chapter 31, verses 2-3. They found favor in the wilderness, those who had escaped the sword of Pharaoh. I've told you this already, that in the very early days of the church, when these dreadful persecutions came to the church, that the church also took refuge in the wilderness, literally, because we have the extraordinary testimony of the desert fathers. There were men who went out into the desert singly first, and then eventually gathered into groups and formed communities, and the church survived in the desert while it was being persecuted in the most dreadful way in the cities. What John wants to tell us is that in the end times which we're living in, that the very same thing is going to happen again. In Rome, the people had to literally go underground into the catacombs. Now, we won't have to go underground. The Lord's going to make a place of refuge for us all to survive. But the church is going to have to go into the wilderness again to survive the persecution of antichrist, who will create millions of martyrs. But the church will survive, because the New Jerusalem will happen. And that's just the way it is. But John is also saying what Paul said to us in Colossians 3, 1-3, and that is that if we're living a life hidden with Christ in God, a true spiritual life, that we have the Lord's favor on us and we have his protection as well. So long as we are living this union with God, a union of love and a union of wills, that we're trying to do God's will on earth as well as we possibly can in union with him. But we will be pursued by the demon who utterly wants to destroy the church. Okay. So who is this dragon? And he's identified finally in verse 9. The great dragon, the primeval serpent known as the devil or Satan. So what John does is he picks up all the titles that have been thrown around in various places in Scripture, and he pulls them all together and he says, we have one enemy. He shows himself in different ways. He has different manifestations, but it's the one enemy who wants to destroy us. And he wants to destroy you whether you belong to Woman Israel or Woman Church. It's good to know that. Thanks for listening. Slán agus beannacht dé live. Goodbye. God bless you.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Shalom World Podcasts. We'll see you right back here tomorrow. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and others.